I don't even want to say that we're unique. It seems to be a human thing that we double down on treating the working class who's really serving us on an essential level. We give them worse conditions and have less empathy and sympathy for their situation.
Mm-hmm. And we think that because the work is dirty, that it's somehow lesser or beneath us. But man, if the ability to kill an animal humanely, the ability to kill an animal with your hands even, and then cut it up, take the skin off, take out what's essential, and then use that animal. I mean, that is an incredible skill. That requires a lot of proficiency. Yeah, I come from a family of hunters. I've got a lot of people in my life that can go into the woods and kill something, and then what is the word for when you process? There's a word for when you process it, so that like normally, I would have to take it to a butcher or somebody like that, to like cut it up, but they can just do it. They know what they're doing, and then I mean that's it's so respectable and admirable that they can do that. And I'm sure we have a ton of people in the food production industry that have developed really, they've developed their nervous systems to perform these precise movements, just like a surgeon or a mechanic or anybody else that has like a highly technical skill. Food production also requires that. Yeah, it's sad that we don't honor those people more. We're all part of the system, but everybody plays their part. I remember earlier in the pandemic, I remember going, tensions were high, resources were, emotional resources were strained. And I remember going shopping. I walked to the grocery store and like, we weren't even like quite sure what kind of mask to wear. It was like, this is like March or April. And I picked up some groceries and I brought them home. And the person that checked me out was older, had to have been in their 50s or 60s, right? And I came home and I remember I was talking to my wife and I described this person going in and putting themselves at risk for the benefit of everybody. And I just started crying. I was like, this person is so brave. And yet they're just checking out my groceries. But it was also like a really great moment for me because I felt like there was a cultural recognition. Like everybody was like, hey, appreciate your essential workers. We need, everybody had a moment of noticing that those people on the other side of the counter are serving us. And in that moment, it really felt like they were helping us all survive. And they do. And they deserve that respect. And I wish that we compensated them appropriately. Because
especially like through this period of time.
Yeah.
I'm sure that they're dealing with some level, not everyone, but a lot of cashiers are dealing with some level of PTSD right now. And I totally get what you're saying. I remember walking in before this thing had become the new normal, and it was eerie how you didn't see people out except in places getting their essential foods and services. But you also knew that you were surrounded by people with COVID and you didn't know if COVID was going to kill you. And that cashier is standing there, not turning down any customer, one by one, having a potentially fatal, invisible illness pass by, risking infection every single day for $12 an hour or $15 an hour, or whatever it is. And they didn't sign up for that either when they signed up to be a cashier. It wasn't like they signed up to go fracking and it happened to be dangerous. They thought that they were going to be checking out people's fruits and vegetables and meatloafs. But then they found themselves doing that and they showed up. And I told many cashiers, like, you guys really are some of the heroes right now.
They were. And it was a great turn. It was a great turn of events for us all to see that and to have that moment. Cause you couldn't, before the pandemic, you couldn't imagine a situation where the person checking out your groceries is the hero, but they were. There was also during that same time period, there was a story about how a number of retired healthcare workers, so meaning that they're older, they're more of a vulnerable population, they're more likely to be at risk of having serious complications from COVID, coming out of retirement and going back to work in those healthcare settings because of the demand. I mean, yeah, there's been a lot of demonstrations of heroism throughout this, for sure.
Speaking of heroes, when I was a little kid, Rambo was one of my first heroes.
We're from that generation where a lot of our heroes are well, I think they'd be considered toxically masculine now.
Yes.
Yes.
And my introduction to Rambo was on like public television on Saturdays. They not PBS, but we didn't have cable, just whatever those channels were on Saturdays. And I remember like my dad having friends over and Rambo 2 or 3 being on, and them just talking about how that he was a hero to them. And I was like, okay, so this guy's a hero to these guys who may or may not be my hero. And he was just blowing a bunch of shit up, and I didn't really get it. And then I saw the first Rambo, and I was like, oh, in fact, he blows very little up in the first movie. He spends a lot of the movie running away and being confused.
Mm-hmm.
But his ability to be calm under pressure, to make a decision, to fight for what's like right, and to fight for his survival at all costs and against all odds. And the fact that he manages to just skate by on top as just this regular fellow, the same archetype deal as Rocky. Like you can tell that Stallone was working with a certain image in his head. Was really cool to me. I was like, oh, okay. Arnold Schwarzenegger was the other really big star at the time, as far as those hyper masculine movies went. And he just looked like a cartoon character to me physically, which was really neat. But I didn't know if I even wanted to like look like a cartoon character. I didn't know if I wanted to. I figured if you were like that jacked, then you had to operate a machine gun and be the Terminator. Like that was the only way. And I didn't know if I wanted to sign up for that.
Yeah, but look how jacked you are now.
Only it's all an illusion. You see me in pictures, and I'm the smallest guy in the groups that I'll be in. But Arnold's probably still bigger than me. But Stallone got jacked for a long time, and then that became something I thought was pretty cool too. Once he hit like 50 and was still looking better than all. In fact, he started looking better because I think medicine or technology got a little better. Yeah. He leveled up. And I was like, whoa, I would love to. I had this image of once you're 35, you just kind of get a beer gut, like a significant beer gut, not just a layer because you like drinking beer, but a beer gut. And that was just the end of the road physically. And then you just sat around and watch football. And that was okay. But I just figured that. And then I was like, oh, like this guy's still working out and like he's doing like gym stuff. And it's not just Nolan Ryan that can be physically active till he's 50. And that was pretty cool.
Well, there was also Jean-Claude.
Yes.
He was probably my top guy back in the era. And I remember hearing at one point in like the early 1990s, oh, Jean-Claude, he doesn't actually do martial arts. He can't actually fight, but he just does gymnastics. Is what somebody told me. And I remember thinking, okay, so gymnastics, that must be how, like, it didn't negate any of his heroic features to me. I was like, he's still totally badass, but I must also now do gymnastics so I can become like that. I mean, kids, now that I've got my own kids, it's very like, you don't realize how much they absorb. Like those images of those men on the screen doing those, quote unquote heroic things, really just killing everybody. It gets imprinted on you in such a powerful way. I mean, I've got videos and journal entries documenting my workouts when I was like, 7 or 8 years old. I'm lifting weights, trying to be like Arnold and Van Damme and Stallone and all these guys I see on the screen. And it's really interesting because my children now, they're 5 and 3, and this week I made a very intentional decision because they're growing up in a different era than I did, right? And toxic, I have experienced a lot of, and I will say, toxic masculinity in my life, mostly, some just from the men that were sort of in my life, but also from my experiences in martial arts, right? It can attract a lot of different personalities, and some of those personalities, for better or worse, do have that toxic element to them.
And also maybe, and this is probably part of toxic masculinity, but maybe we're bullies rather than noblemen.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's something that we should talk about a little bit when it comes to martial arts. But so my kids, they're surrounded by screens all the time. The expectations of the genders are much more fluid nowadays than they were when I was growing up. And I imagine that'll just continue into the future. But I made a really intentional decision. We try not to let them have too much screen time. And we've been very wary about showing them any kind of violence on the screen, but they still see it, normally in animated form. Well, this week I decided to show them some mixed martial arts at the ages of 5 and 3. Probably too young, but I was intentional about it. I did it on purpose. And I had a plan. I was like, all right, I want to implant some of those heroic images into my children, but I want to do it not because I need them to sit in front of a TV and be entertained. I want to do it because I really want them to see the value in this. And so I didn't start with modern mixed martial arts because I don't think that's nearly as accessible. So I started with the first prizefighting championship. And for anybody listening who's not exposed or hasn't been exposed to the prizefighting championship, this was an organization now defunct that was a competitor to the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And these events occurred over in Japan. And they were incredible. It was common for them to sell out stadiums of 20, 50,000 people. And the Japanese really had a strong appreciation for martial arts, and the ethos of these competitions were a little bit different than here in the US. And one of the things I always say about martial arts and particularly sport fighting is that competitors have an opportunity to show a part of themselves that in everyday life, they normally will not get a chance to show. So I let my kids watch 2 fights. The first one was I forget the Japanese gentleman's name, but there's like a Japanese judo black belt versus a guy named John Dixon. So this is also back before weight classes. So you could have
shit. I got to write a note.
Yeah. This is back before weight classes. So the judo player is outweighed by at least 50, 60 pounds by John Dixon, who's an American fighter. And they start trading blows and the judo guy, he gets a hip toss, throws the bigger man to the ground, pounds him a little bit, and then snatches an arm bar. And so I was really clear to my kids. I was like, look, first of all, you don't get to watch this unless you show me self-control, because martial arts is about self-control. So if you can, and so one of my kids, he's a mover. He's got to move all the time. And he had to sit still and watch his screen if he was going to do this. And he was excited because it's screen time. It's something that he's heard about. He's heard about MMA, but he's never really seen it. And I was very clear. I was like, look, both of these grown men are choosing to play a game. And the only reason it's okay to use your body against someone like this is because both people say yes. Like there's consent involved, right? When we talk about consent from a very early age. And I was like, look, they both tried hard. They were both brave, and they had a fight, and nobody got hurt. Because at the end, John Dixon, he was caught in an arm bar. He was having his elbow hyperextended, and he just tapped out, and it was over. And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing that martial arts has given to us, the ability to test ourselves without having to die in combat. Well, I showed him that fight. It was a great introduction. And then I let him watch the next fight too. Well, the next fight is this classic
Rampage Jackson dumping someone on their head.
Well, dude, it's Gary Goodridge versus Oleg Doctoroff.
Okay.
So 2 legends. Yeah, no, No, not. It's really it's one of the more brutal knockouts that you're going to see because Oleg Doctoroff was a sambo competitor, an incredible grappler, and he's given up at least, I'm going to say at least 30 pounds, maybe 50 pounds to Gary Goodridge. I think Gary Goodridge was up around 250 and Oleg was like maybe under 200 pounds. And, you know, my memory of that fight is just the brutal knockout, but Oleg actually does pretty well for himself on the feet up until the end. And then at the end, you have Gary Goodridge, this enormous human being. He lands a clean shot, and Oleg Doctoroff is out cold, lands face down, not moving. And Gary Goodridge, who was an absolute savage, leaps upon him and then strikes him 2 more times as hard as he can while he's already unconscious, right? And we stopped. And so before the end of the fight, I'm telling, Oleg Doctoroff is bleeding. As blood's pouring down his face. They're both trying hard. They both start sweating a lot. And I'm saying to my kids, look how hard they're working. Look how hard they're working. Look, Oleg is bleeding now. But look at his face. He's so brave. He keeps on working hard. He doesn't quit. And then look how much they're sweating. They're really, really trying. And then at the end, I stop the fight and I say, okay, what happened? Did anybody get hurt? And they could tell, yes, somebody got hurt. And I said, okay, why did they get hurt? And they were like, well, because Gary, they actually just called him the brown one because they're kids.
Because they're right.
Yeah, I mean, they're observing the environment.
Sure.
They're like, Gary didn't actually, I think they call him the brown one at first, and then they started calling him Gary because at the end they said Gary didn't control himself. And I said, well, that's true. Gary could have won the game. The game was won as soon as Oleg fell asleep on the ground, and Gary hit him 2 more times, and Gary didn't control himself. And then I allowed them to watch, and it takes a while for Oleg to come back too. Like, it's a real brutal knock. It's one of those knockouts where the guy is just asleep for like over 5 minutes, and I let him watch the whole thing because I wanted him to see an example of a fight where both people tried hard and somebody loses, somebody wins, and nobody gets hurt. And I also want him to see another example of both people try hard and somebody does get hurt, and what that looks like. And we'll see, every time you're raising a human being, there's a certain amount of experimentation that goes into it. And I'll be the first to say, I'm no expert in child rearing, just sort of muddling my way through it. But we'll see. I'm trying to help them reap some of the values, instill some of the values of martial arts through that exposure, that kind of exposure to some of the lessons that are behind the violence.
That's the lessons behind the violence are why I have made the trade to experience and participate in some of the violence in my life, because it has developed my character and also serves a lot of practical purposes in not just like in the past tense, but in having an active practice in martial arts. I think that's a beautiful thing and a beautiful way to start introducing it more so to your children. I think that introducing children to martial arts at a young age can either be a gift or a curse. And I got to help you for a little while teach young children in the classes that the martial arts classes that you teach for kids. What age group is that specifically?
Yeah, when you and I were teaching that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class together, that was were those kids striking too, or was it just
striking too?
Oh, so it was a mixed martial arts class. Those kids, the youngest one had to have been 8, and I believe we went up to age 12 in that class. So it was like 8 to 12-year-olds.
Okay. Yeah, and you were very careful in how you cultivated and how you positioned what you were teaching. You would explain the purpose behind a purpose bigger than breaking somebody's nose or knocking somebody out within the martial arts, and then explain the application and the connection between the physical attacker or self-defense move.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen, like, we've got girls as young as 5 who have been practicing for a couple of years and are proficient enough to defend themselves. And the way that it gets introduced at my academy is very real in terms of practicality, but as far as the metaphors and the energy and the lessons learned, it's important to cultivate that 5-year-old girl in a way that it's building confidence and teaching peace, and teaching choice and freedom versus the opposite.
Can I ask, do you
Please.
teach in your academy, do they teach chokes and joint locks to kids that age?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That was always, I haven't been able to teach kids for over 10 months now due to the pandemic. But when I go back, I had never taught children chokes, because when you teach a choke, you're teaching how to take a life.
Yes.
But I think when I go back, I've always been so careful and diligent about making sure I have the teaching the appropriate context of these techniques. But when I go back, I think I am going to teach chokes and joint locks. Just I want them to have all the tools and be able to reap all the lessons that they can.
It's just a thought. It's not a be all end all, but in teaching a young child to defend themselves, for instance, the kids that get to train at our academy learn a lot of judo stand up, which is, I mean, you're a judo practitioner. It's pretty practical for real life as far as stand up altercations and situations versus sometimes like shooting a double leg on concrete.
Oh yeah.
And if you toss someone as a young person, because better than I, kids can bounce off things like balls. And if you toss somebody and it's a serious altercation and that's it, that can quickly become a problem. So it can be helpful for a kid to learn and like that's where an arm bar gets like transitioned into their curriculum. All right, I've thrown this person down. Now, how do I immobilize them? Now, how do I prevent that arm from doing what it was going to do to me, and that kind of stuff? And I think that seeing that style of self-defense is something that drew a lot of children in your generation to seeing Jean-Claude Van Damme. And I think Jean-Claude Van Damme for your generation, and I know that he was a big influence on bringing American kids who were the first generation of like my academy, which has Cesar Gracie lineage. Cesar Gracie is Brazilian, and he put out some of the first world-class black belts in America, like Jake Shields, Nick Diaz, and they had seen Jean-Claude Van Damme as a regular guy using almost purely martial arts in movies that didn't have the blockbuster appeal at the time, that had more women coming in because there was so much martial arts involved. It was and a lot of it. It's funny that person had said he's just who did gymnastics, because he really could fight. Not necessarily on the level of it would work well against an MMA guy in the UFC today, but he could really fight.
Well, he was absolutely a super fit, athletic human being. Yeah. And that makes a difference. And the pursuit of martial arts is not the pursuit of athletic attributes, but and really, in essence, martial arts is a physical technology that you're going to use to negate somebody else's athletic prowess, but they're not totally separate either. Like one can support the other for sure. And Jean-Claude was an athlete, right? He was incredibly fit.
He was shredded also.
Yeah.
Shredded. He was, again, it's one of these ego things. Like, he's what I strive to attain or maintain or whatever, like that kind of physique now. But when I didn't know how to fight, or I was more insecure or whatever, I was more in pursuit of like the Arnold Schwarzenegger type supersize look, in order to in my mind, that's more mentally intimidating. I don't want to mess with this big guy. Even though practically speaking, which becomes a metaphor for life, like that lack of athleticism that all that extra mass causes ultimately holds you back. It, for the short term, is good in theory, but if what you do initially, or you need some endurance, or someone else is trained and quicker, then that size doesn't actually do anything for you, versus someone conditioned like Jean-Claude Van Damme was, who that conditioning was a reflection of what he could continue to maintain or continue to do within a physical altercation.
And this is the incredible allure of martial arts, is that you can, it just teaches so much about, it teaches about power, because martial arts, it's in many schools, jiu-jitsu schools in particular, it becomes this culture of navigating physical domination, essentially, because you've got different ranks, and in a jiu-jitsu school, at least, the color of your belt kind of determines whose ass you can kick in the room. And there's a lot to be learned from being in that kind of environment. And that's also, but you don't get those belt ranks from just getting stronger and more athletic than everybody else. If you have a good professor, a good coach in jiu-jitsu, they're not going to give you your next rank until you can win, or until you can express technique as a way of dealing with your classmates, dealing with your opponents in matches. It's not because you're not going to get a belt quicker because you're bigger or stronger or faster. The fastest way you're going to get a belt is through mastering the techniques. And that's the allure of martial arts, that there's a technology out there that's going to allow you to prevail, or techniques that you can master that allow you to prevail against somebody that's physically your superior. As a health and fitness professional now, that was actually one of the things that held me back as a trainer initially. When I first started coaching people, I was a competitive martial artist. That was my main passion, for sure. And I didn't really know how to help people that didn't have a physical pursuit like that. If they were like a tennis player and they just wanted to, play tennis super hard, well, then I felt like I could help them on their conditioning front by helping them push their bodies the way I had learned how to push myself in martial arts. But I never took as much care with, and this is, I was also in my early to mid 20s, and that's relevant. I never took as much care with my strength and conditioning. It always felt like a side thing. I was like, instead of focusing so much on the fitness, I'm just going to keep going after that technique, trying to get better and better technique. And I paid a price for that later, when I learned that, in order to support my martial arts habit, I needed to have a really solid foundation in strength and conditioning. I was so in love with that allure of mastering technique that I didn't realize that some other physical care, I need to take care of my body in order to support that pursuit.
All gas, no brakes.
Yeah. It's like, I saw this meme this week that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a pursuit is not a good health and wellness practice. Like, yes, it burns calories. Yes, you might lose some weights. Yes, you're moving. All those things are great. But by themselves, that's not going to, jiu-jitsu might make you a little more mobile, but it's not going to make your joints last longer by itself. It's like akin to, if strength and conditioning is gathering firewood, then jiu-jitsu is like having a bonfire. I don't totally agree with that, because I don't think jiu-jitsu by itself is all about breaking your body down. But it is true that you need to have some other disciplines in your life to support a martial arts habit if you're going to go to a certain level with it. if you're going to maximize your potential, you're also going to need to do some strength and conditioning. Now, if you're a sedentary person and you just need something to do and you need to move your body, yes, martial arts way better than doing nothing. But if you want to reach the highest levels, you will also have to do strength and conditioning.
I used to explain it like longevity and performance, and that the body was meant to not that the body was meant, but that the body would like to stay balanced, that we have natural alignment that creates like the best weight dispersion among our joints and throughout our spine, which kind of creates the directions with which we move throughout the universe. And we do that best with certain biomechanics. And when you break from that and start especially trying to perform athletics at a high level, you're making your life, you're telling your physical body that you're making your life about a different goal, and it will begin to adapt your skeleton to being most efficient at that goal. But because of the body's efficiency at adaptation, it was going to do that while sacrificing that ideal alignment that it would like to have for longevity, that it would like to have to, for instance, avoid arthritis or have the least pressure possible on your discs in your spine, which isn't to be weak, it's to preserve their integrity for as long as possible so that they can stay being strong. And so as a high level athlete, if you wanted to allow your body to adapt to the degree that it could perform at a very high level at a sport, then it was almost vital, probably is for 99% of people, that they do exercises when they weren't training and live a life when they weren't training that essentially directly countered every one of those movements and positions they found themselves in a lot. And for many different sports, athletes spend a lot of time crouched, as an example, which starts to create anterior head carriage and that upper cross syndrome and round internally rotated shoulders and tight chest, which creates headaches, and being crouched over creates tight hip flexors and all of those muscles that might give us a strong core, but actually start messing up our alignment when we try to stand up straight. And as we've talked about before, simply doing a very mild regimen on a regular basis can prevent the majority of that. And you can find a happy medium. And pride is a very special thing in my mind as far as martial arts that hopefully we'll see a cycle of again one day. And maybe like ONE FC or maybe Bellator is heading in that direction. But you mentioned it. You were talking about.
Yeah, you're referring to Pride Fighting Championship.
Pride Fighting, which is what you let your kids see when you were telling that story earlier. Yeah. And one of the unique things about Pride that the UFC initially adopted, and then in order to go mainstream, the UFC has kind of created the most balanced competitive sport version of fighting, I think, that we've seen, real fighting. But in Pride, matchups could happen with any weight classes. And matchups were often done to create interesting fights rather than balanced fights in terms of styles. And that was an incredible metaphor for life. In fact, I always hear stories of how the contracts would specifically say we do not test for steroids. So the cast of characters within the Pride roster looked like the Street Fighter game. Like it was, were small guys and big guys and guys in gis and boxers and wrestlers. But a lot of these guys were like huge freaks. And probably the majority of the competitors were on performance enhancing drugs. And because they gave people that choice, it skewed the relative fairness of what was going on. And in real life, life's not fair. So, I'm my, whatever you call it, my adopted lineage is Cesar Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and I train under Randy Spence and Nate Diaz. And I went there to pursue my martial arts development, in big part because of my respect for Nick Diaz, who is Nate's older brother. And Nick Diaz was very successful in Pride and never did a steroid in his life. And so anytime he accepted a match, it was a David versus Goliath scenario almost any time. There were a couple of times he fought similar size guys, but he also fought guys who were juiced on all kinds of stuff. And because they knew that that was the game, they accepted the fact that it wasn't going to be fair. And for most ultra successful people, life was not fair. And their ability to learn how to overcome that adversity and problem solve at progressively more intense levels is what made them successful human beings and gave them the opportunity to create security for themselves. And so every time Nick Diaz stepped in that Pride ring, he was living a whole life within one training camp and fight, where he went and tested his humanity of seeing if he could overcome essentially insurmountable odds, and accepted the fate, accepted that it may well not work out, accepted that he had disadvantages, and made no excuse for that. And that is a really neat part of what Pride was, and in an extension, being a martial artist and existing in the world of mixed martial arts, where you learn to be uncomfortable with potentially unfair and bad situations. And that's like real life within self-defense, and then also many metaphors that go on like in your progression within the sport and within the gym, within the training room, where the universe and your training gives you things that you can never deal with progressively. And once you learn how to deal with something, it hands you something else. And you will have a lot of failures, and you'll have disasters, and you'll have bad accidents, and you'll learn to accept that fate as you accept each new challenge, because the same risk comes over and over and over. And I love it.
And particularly in our culture, one of the places that we are most uncomfortable being is on the losing end. We hate losing. And whenever we tell stories about people that we respect and admire, we're always talking about the success that they had. And maybe we'll talk about how they struggled and they overcame, but we really emphasize that success element. One of the icons of the Pride Fighting Championship was somebody that was in a similar place to Nick Diaz, and that's and Kazushi Sakuraba was his name. And the reason that he was in a similar place is because he was not juiced to the gills. Sakuraba was truly inspirational for me growing up, because when he got into the ring, every single time he got into the ring, he would do a new move. And it wasn't just, he actually came from a background of professional wrestling, which is, fake fighting, where you're doing crowd pleasing techniques against a willing opponent. For the most part, a little bit different in Japan, but that's the basic premise. And he would come in and he would do these pro wrestling moves in a real fight. And he was there to entertain the crowd. And he often fought people that were bigger, that were on steroids, and that he was absolutely outmatched. And the Japanese would do this to their heroes. They would put them in complete mismatches where there was no hope. Like, they weren't going to win those fights. And a lot of times they didn't win those fights. At the end of Sakuraba's match against Ricardo Arona, he took multiple knees to the face. And there was a picture of him on my desktop after that fight for years, because at the end of that fight, both of his eyes were swollen shut. His face was just a mask of blood. But he never gave up. And he kept on fighting, even in the face of insurmountable odds, even in the face of absolute defeat. Sakuraba was the one that I always remember, but there were many Japanese fighters, many fighters of all nationalities, that when they get in there, even when they have no hope of winning, they'll keep on fighting. And I can't think of a better example of being uncomfortable, or finding a way to be comfortable in an uncomfortable situation, than getting your ass kicked in front of hundreds, if not thousands of people, but still trying to win. And that's a key component, because just getting in there and taking a beating, you know, just hurting yourself, nobody grows from that.
Right.
But getting comfortable with the fact that you might not be able to overcome a situation, but still trying your best and still doing what you can in that moment, that shows something about who you are.
Yeah.
And that kind of it's a little bit of a pivot, but it feels like a good segue to point out that one of the greatest things that anybody can get from the martial arts is the idea of a growth mindset. When we talk about people that are successful, we talk about their successes, and, you know, again, maybe we'll touch on their struggles. We always think about their highlight reel, but the truth is, for many of those people, their low light reel is as long, sometimes longer, than their highlight reel. But every one of those losses that they took in life, you know, literal or metaphorical, they use them as learning opportunities. And that is one of the greatest things that you can get from martial arts, or any pursuit where you're not competent, but you keep on trying and you slowly develop competence over time. The only way to do that is to encounter the failures and try and figure out how you failed, and then try to do better afterward.
For me, my main thing is trying to never walk into a practice with the mindset that I will never practice again. So I'm not going to kill myself for no reason. I'm going to save that. And that's an exchange for longevity. Like I want to be there 10 more years or 15 more years, if that's what it takes. I want to be able to be there physically. And I also want to be able to be there mentally. But that isn't a question that most people find themselves having to answer, because for most hobbyists, they're good at programs where kind of time is a marker for like your belt that you'll get and that kind of thing. And they don't have to train hard, and people will do favors, and there's nothing wrong with that. Right. But in my path, I don't want any favors, and favors are, oh, well, I'm going to go easy on you because I know that you're too old, or you're this, or you're that. And then that's not real to me. Because I have a background in life of having real situations outside of gyms and safe spaces. And it's extremely clear to me that in real situations, people don't take it easy on you because you have X, Y, or Z.
Right.
It's the same for everybody. And that's what I feed off of. But that is not what most people I'm 37 now. That's not what most 37-year-olds are doing. Most 37-year-olds are either like high-level martial artists who do it at a professional level, and you're a professional martial artist, like still, like you competed recently before the pandemic and stuff. But of course, I know that's changed for you as far as how big of a priority that is. But most people are kind of within that world, or they are, they're more hobbyists, and a lot of other things take precedent. And I'm interested hearing from you. You said that when people go into a cage, a lot of times the game plan goes out the window. Like, fuck your game plan. And then you're going to have to fall back on your training. And that's got to create a very dynamic psychology within your training and your understanding of what you're doing. And I'm interested to know like an anecdote of one time when you had a fight where the game plan went out the window, and what it felt like to fall back on that training at a time when it was actually there. And I'd also like to know what it felt like when you decided to transition, because on some level you didn't see your your longevity in terms of happiness and success in continuing to make fighting as big a priority as it once was?
Mm-hmm. The first experiences that come to mind when we talk about game plans going out the window are losses that I've had. It's pretty easy to remember a lot of my losses. But when you say to fall back on my training, you mean that my training brought me through, or that I had to adjust my training later, or that?
Well, I'd love a happy ending, but if there are no happy endings, sometimes that's how
it
real
goes,
life
right?
goes. Right.
I remember I competed in a kickboxing tournament in Illinois, in Crystal Lake. That's the home of Jason from the horror movies.
Good energy there.
Yeah. And I had, a good friend who was one of the greatest kickboxers I've ever had the privilege to train with, Aaron Speedy Swenson. He talked me into doing this tournament, and my fiance was there because we weren't married yet. And I go out there in the first round, first ever kickboxing match. And I don't remember what the game plan was, but I know that the game plan was not to go out there and get my ass kicked for a whole round. And that is what happened. But I had enough experience. I've been training for well over 12 or 13 years at that point. And I had enough training to know that what it feels like to be losing. And I knew that was and I had a realistic expectation that might happen. I didn't go in there expecting to win. I would have liked to win. I trained as hard as I could. It was also a short notice fight. I found out about the tournament less than 2 weeks before doing it. And I walked back to my corner after just getting slapped all around the ring. And I was thinking, oh man, my fiance is watching me here. Well, I'm not going to quit. And I'm going to take this, if I have to take a beating for the next 2 rounds, because they were only 3-round matches, amateur kickboxing match. So if I have to take a whooping, I'm not going to cower. I'm going to show her that I can work hard even till the end. I'm going to do my best.
That's
and you know what? Yeah, that's what's up. Well, it turned out that my opponent, who was also relatively inexperienced in the kickboxing world, he had gassed himself out trying to finish me in that first round. And my corner told me, Kyle, it's going to be different this round. It's going to be a different fight. And he was right, because that kid had gassed himself out and he couldn't really fight anymore after that. And so I would say he was probably a better kickboxer than I was, but I weathered the storm, and I was able to come out on top. I won the decision. And then I had another match that was super, super close, but I just edged the guy out. I ended up winning the whole 2 matches, both tough guys, but I ended up winning that tournament.
Did you win both by points, decisions?
Yes, both by points. I'm notoriously pillow fisted when it comes to punching and kicking. Meaning that I don't hit particularly hard. And but I managed to outpoint both of those guys and come out on top. And it was just, it was one of those things where I've actually had 2 victories in, striking events. These victories in kickboxing, and then another victory in mixed martial arts, where at some point I said, well, you know what? I'm not going to win this thing, but I'm not going to go down easy. And I'm going to show everybody here what I'm made of. And I'm going to keep trying till the end. And in these 2 experiences, I was able to win with that mentality, and it was great. But I'm not going to leave this subject without talking about the first match that came to mind. And this was probably my 5th mixed martial arts event, where I fought a wrestler, and I came from a boxing and kickboxing school. I didn't really know how to defend
wrestlers.
Yeah, I didn't know how to defend a single leg at that point. And I was fighting this gentleman named Rich Moskowitz. And Rich Moskowitz took me down and pummeled me for 2 straight rounds. He landed over 100 punches to my face in front of hundreds of people, including my mom and my girlfriend at the time. And I had lost the fight before that to a guillotine choke. And early in this match, Rich got me in just the tightest guillotine choke. And I said, fuck this. I'm not tapping out to a guillotine again. And it was actually way tighter than the guillotine that I lost my last match to. I said, I'm not tapping out to this. And I fought through it. And man, he beat me up so bad. My face was so swollen after this match. And at the very end, like toward the end of the second round, I remember thinking, I can win this thing. I can do it. And he's mounted. He's in full mount, punching me in the face. I'm like, I can do this. I can win this thing. And I remember Marcus Davis was in my corner. He said, "You're all right, Kyle. You're all right." And at
He's not all right. He's not all right.
At the very end, Rich Moskowitz actually sunk in a rear naked choke. So this should have been the end of the match. But I was saved by the bell, and I managed to make it to the end. I lost that decision handily, but the announcer said, "What a show of heart." And he was talking about how badly I got whooped. And I wasn't too upset after that one because, the match that I lost before that, I mentally lost it before I even got in the ring. And I could have won that previous match. Well, here against Rich Moskowitz, I didn't really have a hope of winning that match. I didn't have the skills needed to beat that man. I didn't even have the skills needed to land a single shot because I didn't land anything. But mentally, I was in a different place where I was determined to, above all outs, not give up and keep trying as hard as I could until I was done. And it was that mentality that allowed me to make it to the end of that match. And that was the lesson that I learned. It was that, if you're going to put yourself in these kind of extreme circumstances, you can't beat yourself.
Right. And you can make good shit come out of it. Like not just in retrospect, but you can actively create something good.
Yeah.
If you're playing the long game, if you're going to be dead in the ring, well, that's bad timing. But
yeah,
otherwise, that and people in the prize fighting world understand that there's a big difference between somebody finishing someone and somebody purposely winning by points.
Mm-hmm.
And when you don't kill somebody, like, especially when you said you were gonna, or like that was the energy you were bringing, and you don't, like, that means something.
People don't respect it as much.
That means something. I think that goes back to all the way back to the kids and teaching girls arm bars after they've thrown somebody on the floor. It's really something really special about submissions in prize fighting, and in real life, which we don't see quite so much anymore, but actually a little bit more now that people tape everything on like World Star. But
yeah,
the idea that being a martial artist is so much about self-respect, self-control, power and knowledge of self, that you can be in an hour-long war with someone, and fist fights and mixed martial arts fights, when allowed to, can go for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
You can be in a war with somebody. They've broken bones. They've taken years off your life, and you can make that decision at the very end of a fight when you put them in a position like a choke where they're dead.
Yeah.
And they tap, and the killer, the winner, has the decision. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just a decision to choose to let go, to let the mental victory and the symbolism and meaning of that altercation mean more than eliminating this person's life, even though they were attempting to take your life. And that's a decision, right? It's not good or bad, at least in my mind. And I know that a lot of people feel that that is the admirable thing to do. I think there are exceptions to every rule, but at least within a sanctioned event, that is what you do. The referee will peel you off if you're not letting go.
Yeah.
And that's not really respected. Right.
No.
Right. But that's a huge moment within the world of the martial artist or the prize fighter or someone clinging to their life, that the bystander or the audience isn't always aware of how significant that is, and how much of a serious display of self-control and mental skill that is, to be fighting for your life, be going to a place deeper and darker than you've ever been before, to not give up, like when you were mounted and Marcus Davis was saying you were okay, and you weren't really okay, but you made it.
Yeah.
Right. In a terrifying situation. And then all of a sudden I'll let you live.
Mm-hmm.
I've spent years of my life in situations where I dreamed of not letting certain people live. And until in a tournament and in a gym practice gone wrong and into a real fight, until both of those situations happened where I was choking somebody and I chose to let go, I didn't understand the power that I could possess in letting go of that anger and that rage that would make me want to kill somebody else and end my own life, for better or worse. Because that's within modern society, that's usually what's going to happen.
Yeah, your life is going to be markedly different.
You probably go into the slammer.
Yeah.
Or you'll be real stressed out avoiding the slammer.
I've honestly not thought much about that, Patrick.
It's pretty
I've always
good
just
shit, isn't it?
Yeah, I've always just accepted that as part of the the terms of engagement. And it's really a very interesting and crucial point that we're talking about here. And what is the purpose and nature of fighting? And it's death, isn't it? It's to kill. And yet we found a way to take the fangs out of it, so to speak, and turn it into a game where sometimes nobody even really gets hurt. And I think there's incredible power in that. But I think listening to your story just now, I'm realizing that I've never in my life given that much credence to the fact that it is a game about death. One of the reasons that it feels so powerful, you mentioned earlier, like you don't want anybody doing you any favors. You don't want somebody not trying to finish you in a practice or a match just because, X, Y, or Z, because you want to come face to face with that reality. The game is realistic enough that it matters to you whether or not people are trying their best to finish you, because you want to be that close to reality.
Yeah.
You want to feel like you're fighting for your life.
But
you don't actually want it.
Yeah. I want to know that, and especially like my favorite place to participate in martial arts is within the practice room, because I want to go against these guys who are so high level that I can give it my all. And they're more often than not, the majority of the team will beat me. And, but then I know that they also care about me and they're not going to kill me.
Right.
But I want to be ready for when, somebody's got a gun in my mouth again.
Well, you didn't have the training, did you?
Nope.
At that point when it happened. But now you spent some time walking around in this realm where death is potentially really close. I mean, if you're in a training environment, you trust everybody that's there. They're not going to try and hurt you or kill you, but you're playing the game of how to kill people. And this is really an incredible, beautiful thing about martial arts and a lot of other human practices. Like, human beings do some dangerous shit. I can hear there it is. I can see a helicopter outside my window, right?
That's
people
dangerous.
In the helicopter are hundreds of feet off the ground. That's dangerous.
Right.
Yeah, they could die. But how do we, as a species, how do we deal with things that are so incredibly dangerous, but we still want to be able to do them? And now, today, we do them on a regular basis, right? We travel in cars that go over 60 miles an hour. We get in airplanes, helicopters. We put people in space, for Christ's sake, right? How do we do these things that are so dangerous and how do we navigate them in a way that they are progressively less and less dangerous, and that we can develop some proficiency? Because it really is. And I think that this should be a tenet of all martial arts training everywhere, and it's not. And it pisses me off a little bit. I wish this mentality had been understood when I was coming up. But the way that you develop proficiency in a dangerous arena is you find a way to play that game without it being quite so dangerous. We don't take somebody that's never flown a helicopter and put them in a helicopter and tell them to fly, because all those people would crash and die, right? We spend a long time practicing the basics, and we introduce a little bit of danger. And then we spend a long time practicing more fundamentals, more basics. And we add more and more technique progressively until at some point we're able to put people into space reliably, consistently. But it's only off of this foundation that's been built for generations. I mean, when it comes to martial arts, we're talking thousands of years that people have been practicing these skills.
So cool.
It is. It's incredible. But it becomes, when I was first coming up, mixed martial arts was a new sport, and it's really incredible the evolution of martial arts that we've seen in my lifetime. But traditional martial artists, your taekwondo school, your karate school, these places were mocked for having practices that were too unrealistic. They were too safe. They weren't close enough to that arena of death to be considered valid. And so you'd have, somebody that was a boxer and learned how to wrestle a little bit. They'd think that katas and taekwondo were stupid. And, in a real fight, all those people were wusses, and you totally pound them out.
But then put it all together and you got Stephen Thompson.
Totally. Yeah. One of the greatest martial artists of our time. Well, I really wish
that shit has a place within.
It does.
Within the arts, within fighting. Yeah.
You got to find a way to make it as safe as possible without making it unrealistic. Because if you don't make it as safe as possible, the learning's not going to happen. I mean, that if you're too stimulated, you're not going to learn anything.
Right. Yeah.
Except how to deal with being so stimulated.
I got a funny anecdote about that. Like a year in 2019, I used to box this guy all the time, and I'd fuck him up pretty easily. We did a bunch of rounds. I don't think he ever won one. And I didn't box too much during the pandemic. I came in one day and he was in the gym, been training. And he was like, "Yo, you want to spar?" He was eager. And I was like, "All right, whatever. I can deal with it." And he came in there, and he had been waiting for a year. Just tell immediately. And he beat the brakes off me, and he caught me with one uppercut that had my ears just rang my bell. And I wasn't right for like 3 or 4 days. Who knows if I'm right, but relative, I was impaired for like 3 or 4 days. And I thought to myself, okay, we're not sparring again until I have put in the work of not just jumping in and sparring with guys that I can handle or beat, or getting in there in MMA rounds where I can depend on some other skills, but I need to do bag and pad work and I'll get back to all of the non-contact drills to reinforce those reactions and fundamentals before I'm even going to go in here and do this activity, because it won't be productive for me to just keep trying to pick shots into just getting blasted and not really being able to see anything. Just there's not a lot of utility in that because I hadn't prepared properly. Mm-hmm. But if I prepare properly, I know I can go in there and make it a different situation, but I need to do that work. I'm not going to be ignorant about that.
There's an exceptional amount of mental work that has to happen there too. I mean, in a sense, it's all mental, neurological work.
Integration, right?
Integration, totally.
Integration.
I think this is like, what's the ultimate goal here for any martial artist? In my opinion, the goal is to reach the highest level of nervous system complexity or refinement that's possible for your body. That should be the goal. And this is like such a cool thing to consider, that so for thousands of years people have been practicing martial arts, right? And I think to some degree, you know, fighting is in our DNA, but you don't learn how to throw, or you don't innately know how to throw a good punch.
And you're not innately at home in a fight. Well, most people aren't.
No, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right. Not. So the way that you develop your nervous system to be able to handle these situations and be able to employ these techniques comes from cultivation, right? And not to be too corny, but this is like, I've whatever the opposite of a green thumb is, that's what I have. Like, I'm very lucky to be keeping this cactus alive over here. But when I think of agriculture and cultivating a plant, or like a bonsai tree, like you think about how you nurture its growth. You give it the right nutrients, and then you notice that it's starting to grow in a certain way, and maybe you trim it there, or maybe you put a splint in place so it grows in a certain direction. That's what you're doing with your nervous system when you're practicing martial arts. You're getting it so that it grows in a certain direction. And in a very real biological sense, that's what's happening, right? As we perform movements, we're myelinating those neural pathways, and they become more efficient. They become faster.
You add lanes to the highway as well. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well,
the information superhighway.
Right. Well, when it comes to this sort of double-edged sword between training in martial arts for longevity and training for performance, when I was coming up, there was far too much emphasis placed on performance.
And a lot of more bullies maybe, right? Because there weren't so many tight guys that could just fuck them up and filter them out.
Yeah, that was part of it, right? There were no nerds in jiu-jitsu back then. But, you know, as a young man, you know, full of testosterone, I was like, you know, I want to prove what I'm made of. I want to show what I have on the inside. I want to show my heart. I would put myself in those dangerous situations recklessly. But what I never understood until much later in life, and I had a sense of it, and I tried to like get my teammates to like play with me this way, but nobody ever wanted to. But what I knew was that the more time we can get practicing the best techniques, the correct techniques in a less dangerous environment, the better we're going to get. And, you know, you see this with the Muay Thai population, all those Thai fighters, they'll spend hours just playfully, so playfully, you know, they're not stressed out. They're playfully sparring. They're trying not to hurt each other, but they're trying to be creative, trying to develop those neural pathways, develop that timing. They don't spar hard. They fight for real every couple of weeks, maybe every weekend. They don't spar for real. Their training is this playful, long form interaction that really develops that nervous system to higher and higher degrees.
Yeah.
And I wish that was more commonplace. And far too often, I think we've shortened fighters' careers and prevented their nervous system from getting to the highest possible development by making, you know, having those gym wars, you know, getting those concussions in practice. And I guess it would be beautiful to see a more intelligent approach applied, because I think, you know, the caveat is like, the caveat that people will put out there is like, well, you're never going to develop mental toughness that way. But I think there are other ways to do it. I think there's a possibility. And, you know, you just saw Max Holloway's
out a little bit. No sparring, right?
Yeah. Max Holloway's performance last weekend, you know, he hadn't sparred the entire training camp, comes out, breaks multiple UFC records. You know, Muhammad Ali was notorious for looking terrible in sparring. And then he'd come out and put on these transcendent performances. You can't take the risks that are necessary to get comfortable in the worst situations if those worst situations are actually as terrible as they're really going to be.
Yeah, because there's only so many of those that happen that you get.
Yeah. You can't be in the pocket with an incredible boxer and get out with all your brain cells and develop good form if you're just getting your ass kicked. You need to practice getting in there and seeing the mistakes, but not paying for them. I don't know. I might have gone on a soapbox for a little bit there.
No, and that becomes a metaphor for life, and we're about at 2, so we that becomes a metaphor for life. Though, when you were talking earlier, I kept having this image of video, like almost every within genres. If you're doing like a quest video game, almost all of them are the same. You start out bare bones and you pick up skills and supplies along the way, and each boss of each incremental level teaches you to kind of master or become proficient at that skill, that way of jumping and shooting that works against this bad guy. And as you level up, a good game, like, it doesn't have to really be unique, it just needs to be done well. A good game then gives you a final boss that encompasses most of the skills that you've needed to learn.
Yes.
Right. And unless you've taken the time to do all of that, of course you can get the cheat code, but then anybody can win with invincibility and everything. It's more impressive when you actually go in there and do it. And you can also get paid for it now within video games. But that's kind of like what you're trying to do, right? Like in business, you learn an industry by starting off low level, or like within an apprenticeship or something like that, and you work your way up, and you try to do that in a balanced way so that you don't make too many enemies and you keep getting better, and eventually you know the whole business. But you don't want to just step in and buy a mechanic spot without knowing anything about cars. You want to get this information, you want to batch, you want to take your time. Unfortunately, a lot of this current world isn't set up for people taking their time. But if there's something that you really want to do or really want to be, the best way to do that is to cook it slowly.
And would you say that another way, would you also say, is it also accurate to say that taking your time also means like taking the losses without getting kicked out of the game?
Bingo.
Or taking the losses without the damage that comes with them?
Understand it's all about pacing, right? It's all about time. It's all about space. They say that music, the things that make music unique are the silent aspects. It's not just a note, it's how it's juxtaposed with silence and then the next note. Like, that's where the real music is.
Yeah.
So, and a fighter learns to do this by structuring training camps and understanding how to peak themselves. And no, it's not time to do this, and it's time to stop this now so I can move on to the next phase. But that intentional aspect and creating space and taking your time gives you time to plan those intentions, right? Like, I know you're big into visualization. I like to be able to visualize a couple of things that I'm going to do in a day before I actually do them. I don't want to show up like I've never been there before, or like this is completely new. So if you create the space, and within fighting, if you're, for instance, we were talking about too much of the wrong kind of sparring. If you're never giving yourself a chance to recover or come up with a structured way to keep returning to that peak or that hard test, then what are you really gaining? Another way I look at that within training is the drilling, which goes along with the playful sparring that the Thais do. But when we do a jiu-jitsu practice, it's an hour and a half of drilling, and then we train. But if you just train, then you just get good at spazzing on people, and you don't ingrain those movement patterns that actually help you outsmart an opponent and actually be one step ahead. And that's the way that most of life works. Most people want to end up successful and not have a heart attack at 50 when they finally get what they want. They want to then be able to enjoy it, right? They want to have been like relatively accountable to their families so that they still talk to them, and they don't want to be in massive debt, and they want to have some friends outside of work, and they want to have some friends within work. And if it's all a rush to do that, then you might not be able to account for that kind of stuff, right? It's just this sprint to an arbitrary goal, rather than creating a structure which ultimately becomes a practice, which has all of these positive consequences for who you are and how you feel, and then creates something stable and can last.
Yeah.
Rock
Beautiful.
and
Create
roll.
something stable that can last. Oh, yeah. It's all about Well, it's a lot like investing, right? You got to invest some now. Don't blow it all right now.
Bingo.